Welcome, everyone. My name is Whitney Albright. I work in the Science Institute here at the Department of Fish and Wildlife. And along with my colleague, Nicole Russell, who's also on the line, we organize the department's conservation lecture series. So I'm going to go over, as always, just a few quick logistics and announcements before I introduce our guest speaker. So very quickly for today, you have probably noticed that you are muted, and that is to help us preserve the audio quality for the recording. We are recording the talk today, and within the next couple of weeks, it'll be posted to the Conservation Lecture Series website, the link there at the bottom of the page. And you can go and check out our archive where we have all of our past lectures recorded and posted. As far as flow today, I'll turn it over to our guest speaker here in just a moment, and we'll have a presentation for about 40-45 minutes, and then we'll have the remaining time available for Q&A. For questions today, you'll notice at the bottom of the screen in your kind of icon menu that there's both a chat box and a Q&A icon. The chat is great for communicating either with one another, or if you need to reach myself or Nicole, or have any technical issues, reach out to us that way. But please use the Q&A box for any questions for our speaker. And you can type those in as they come to mind, and we'll get those relayed to her at the end of the PowerPoint presentation. All right, without further ado, that's it for announcements. I am very excited to introduce our guest speaker today, Kriss Neuman. Kriss has spent her career studying and conserving shorebirds and marine birds, with time spent in the field in Alaska, Maine, and the Great Central Flyway. In her current role as a principal ecologist with the Pacific Coast and Central Valley Group at Point Blue Conservation Science, Kriss leads the Coastal Monterey Bay program, which focuses on a long-term study of snowy plover reproductive success. Kriss has worked in close partnership with coastal landowners, resource managers, and decision makers to develop collaborative science-based conservation strategies to protect and sustain the regional snowy plover population, and to protect and enhance sandy beach species and ecosystems along the Central California coast and beyond. So we're very happy to have you today here with us, Kriss. Please give her a virtual welcome. And with that, I will turn it over to you to share your presentation and get us started.
Thanks, everybody, for joining us today. Thank you, Whitney, for the introduction. I'm here today to talk about Western snowy plover, the importance of resilient landscapes and species management and recovery. And I just want to start by acknowledging my co-authors on this project from Point Blue Conservation Science and the National Park Service. I always like to start with a personal story, and this is my story. I study birds because of a plant, which is a funny place to start, but I am a Southern California native, and I grew up in the sandy beach ecosystem of Ventura County, going to the beach, and I had never seen a native dune until I moved to Santa Cruz to attend UC Santa Cruz. And I was able to go out to Wilder Ranch State Beach, and I saw this incredible, beautiful, delicate, resilient plant called the beach morning glory, and was immediately intrigued with sandy beach ecosystems and dune ecosystems. And I've been able to pursue that passion throughout most of my career. So I study birds because of a plant. Now I want to talk for just a second about what the outline of the talk today is going to look like, so you guys have some expectations. So first, I'm going to talk a little bit about background about what is a snowy plover. And then I'm going to talk about kind of two major areas of work that we have been conducting around snowy plovers and climate that comes out of our long-term work with snowy plovers in the Monterey Bay area and on the central coast of California. I'll talk a little bit about the management implications of part two, and then some conclusions. So that's what we're going to do. So to start off with, what is a snowy plover? There's probably a bunch of people here today who know a lot about snowy plovers, and maybe there's some of you who are interested and don't know as much about snowy plovers. So I'm going to go through a bunch of background here, but hopefully it'll be fun and interesting. So one of the most interesting things about snowy plovers is that they are temperate latitude nesting species of shorebird, which is really fairly unusual in that group of birds. And it's put them obviously into conflict with a lot of things that have led them to be imperiled. And I'll talk more about that in a second. Their whole evolutionary history is that they're adapted to primary successional habitat, which you can see in this photo here. And what that means on coastal beaches is that this is an environment that's maintained by constant perturbation from waves, from wind, and it keeps vegetation at an early sort of successional stage or an early cirral stage. And then there's lots of bare ground and drift debris. And the nest scrapes that they build are just built in sand. They're literally a scrape in sand. You can see a hatching nest here with 2 chicks and 1 egg. They're lined very sparsely with shells and other small objects. They typically lay a 3-egg clutch. And one of their major adaptations over their evolutionary history is to have these cryptic eggs and chicks, which you can see really well in this shot. And that's because they evolved with land predators throughout their history. So it's really critical that nests and chicks in particular are very difficult to see. Like all shorebirds, the young are precocial. So they hatch and they leave the nest within a few hours of hatching and begin, self-feeding as they're shepherded around by their parent, which is typically the male, which is another really unique thing in the shorebird group. It's a long breeding season. It starts in California and throughout along the Pacific coast. Starts in March and extends through September, which allows them to have multiple nests. Even if their first nests are successful, both males and females will have second nests. And so their habitat requirements are, you've seen a little bit in the previous slides, but these open sandy outer coastal beaches are one of the primary places that they nest along the Pacific coast and along the Central coast. This is Salinas River National Wildlife Refuge. It's situated in the center of Monterey Bay. You can see this quite extensive dune system, Salinas River in the background and the head of the Salinas Valley. So this is very typical snowy plover breeding habitat throughout their range. This is another example, Moss Landing State Beach, which is another outer coastal beach. And you can see that this one is backed by wetlands. There are in the background there, you can see both the sinuous course of Elkhorn Slough, which is a major regional wetland, and then also that area that's just to the left of Elkhorn Slough, where you can see some sort of boxy looking areas, which is the Moss Landing Wildlife Area. Which is a CDFW property. So one of the other unique things about snowy plovers, and this is an interesting piece of what they do in California, is that they also nest in salt evaporation ponds, which are either defunct or semi-managed in order to promote nesting. And other examples of this are Bolsa Chica down in the Orange County area. And then the really major one in California is within the San Francisco Bay Area, where plovers exclusively nest in managed ponds, many of them former salt ponds. And the CDFW site there of interest is Eden Landing Ecological Reserve, which is the most important place within San Francisco Bay for snowy plovers. So lots of CDFW properties in California have a lot of plovers. So I want to talk for a second about causes of population decline. For the plover, it's a familiar list. Human-caused disturbance, predators, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. Landscape change, which is one of those ones I really like to highlight because landscape change is really driving changes in the predator community and in human-caused disturbance. And of course, alternate uses of landscape, such as urbanization and agriculture abutting our coastal areas, has really put the coastal habitats under pressure for this species and for other species. So those 3 things have been really critical in the decline of the snowy plover. And because of this population decline, the Pacific Coast population of the Western snowy plover was federally listed as threatened in 1993. And so a little bit more on predators, because it's very relevant for the stuff I'm going to talk about later. I mentioned that, predators have been a significant source of population decline, and that includes non-native or introduced predators such as the red fox, which was introduced in many places in California for sport hunting and for fur farming. Corvids in particular, the common raven, but many corvids, crows and ravens, other corvids as well. Crows and ravens are really the primary issues for snowy plovers. They're an exponential population growth. And that landscape alteration that I mentioned earlier has been a key factor for them. And they're obviously impacting many other imperiled species. And many other coastal nesting waterbird species, such as the California least tern and the marble murrelet. And then we have other listed or sensitive species, the peregrine falcon on the right, which was delisted recently, and also the northern harrier, which is, sort of subject to the same coastal squeeze between what's been happening with urbanization and land use changes in coastal plain areas and the coastal beaches, where the snowy plover also nests. And so I wanted to talk a little bit too really quickly, because it's also relevant for later, about the foraging ecology of the plover and the sandy beach food web. So the critical inputs in the sandy beach food web are large kelps like Macrocystis and Nereocystis, which are cast on the beach. So when we talk about beach rack, this is what we're talking about. So this is a Macrocystis among other things. And then the consumers of Macrocystis form the prey for snowy plovers. And so that's Teletrid amphipods. And then also in this slide, you can see it's a little bit blurry, but on the bottom right there, those are flies that are actually consuming the kelp. So the snowy plover is a visual predator, unlike other members of the shorebird family, where they're locating prey and they're plucking it off the surface. So their prey are on the surface, primarily flies and amphipods and other things on the surface. But this proximity to the rack line, which is at or below mean high water level, is really critical for them. That's where they exist. They're not sort of running in and out of the waves and probing and feeding on crustaceans like other species in the sandy beach zone. They're at the high rack. And so I mentioned the federal listing of the Pacific Coast population. This is the population trajectory. And this trajectory begins in 2005. The species, or the Pacific Coast population, was listed in 1993. So this is just sort of a recent snapshot. And it shows you the breakdown of the population across the recovery units. And so you can sort of look at those corresponding recovery units and see where the bulk of the population is. But the thing that I really want to point out about this slide is that this is the recovery target. So this population has been listed since 1993, and we have sort of seemingly stabilized at a level that is somewhat below recovery. At the same time, we have imminent threats from climate change that are difficult to manage and need to be addressed in order for the species to recover and to exist further into the future. So I wanted to do a couple fun things. I can't see all of you, but I hope this is fun, and it's hopefully a little bit more interactive. I mentioned that plovers have a 3-egg clutch, and so I'm going to give you guys a second to find the nest here if you haven't already found it. This is a really good example of a primary successional species. This is saltbush atriplex, which is one of the primary colonizers along the drift line. You can see some dried bull kelp or Nereocystis right there. So this is a really typical snowy plover nesting habitat. In case you haven't located it yet, there is the nest. And then we're going to do this also for adults. So this is a typical sandy beach. This is also Monterey Bay. And the adults blend in really well in their environment. They look like driftwood. Giving you guys a minute to find how many adults. If you guessed 3, you are correct. There's one here, there's one here. These guys are helping us out a little bit by also being color banded, which is something that we do to track population demographics. And then here's a bird doing a classic lure display, which is a tail drag. And you can see that bird's a little bit harder to see, but also just generally how well they blend in with their landscape. And as I pointed out earlier, this is their anti-predator evolutionary history. I have a couple of videos, and I just wanted to also share these. They're each 1 minute, and I will take the sound down a little bit once they get going, but this is just a really neat view of a hatching nest. And then second video. So I hope you guys enjoyed that. I hope it's illuminating to see a little bit more of a close-up view of the species. And that's actually quite an old video, nest video, but I never get tired of watching. And one of the couple of unique things you see there is the male removing the nest shell, which is also anti-predator. And then you see him kind of flying back in and calling the chicks back in to be brooded. If you were really a good observer, you would have seen that third chick that was still in the process of hatching actually still had an umbilicus area where it was absorbing the rest of the yolk sac. So now we're going to transition into the next section here and talk about how snowy plovers will be affected by climate change. And we're also going to look at the beach dune ecosystem. And I'm going to lead you guys through two different approaches that we took to explore plovers and climate. So the first one is this broad conceptual framework around climate that we developed. And the second one is a much more data-driven, analytical, spatially explicit framework. Our overall objective, we've been working with snowy plovers and managing them in this region for decades, since about 1984. So we had this broader objective to understand climate change. And that objective is to understand the climate vulnerabilities of the snowy plover and the beach and dune ecosystem and incorporate this understanding into future conservation strategies. And this is for Monterey Bay and Point Reyes. If you think back to that population slide for Recovery Unit 4, Monterey Bay and Point Reyes pretty much comprise the bulk of the population in Recovery Unit 4. And that's what we were considering here. So in this first part, which is a conceptual framework of vulnerability, we really wanted to think about the species and the habitat. And so in the process of doing this, we realized that vulnerability for this species, and it may be true for a lot of species, but in particular for this species, because it's literally on the front lines of climate change with sea level rise, that the consideration of the habitat was really critical. We also wanted to think about site prioritization. And in this report that we produced, we did do a quasi-quantitative site prioritization based on some existing data sets, not any of our own data. So what we did was a unique approach, which was really this conceptual approach based on expert knowledge and elicitation. It was very data poor. And what we did was identify climate impacts. And so this is an example here I'm going to walk you through. So we identified these climate impacts or climate drivers, and then these sort of secondary impacts to the habitat. And then we identified very explicitly species and habitat vulnerabilities. And so I'm going to just walk you through this one. So sea level rise will result in lower elevation beaches, which will create an increased risk of nest mortality due to flooding. And we developed this whole matrix around this where other drivers would potentially be feeding into the same secondary effects of those drivers. And so in this case, increased storm frequency and decreased riverine sediment probably also going to result in lower elevation beaches, which will also result in increased nest mortality due to flooding. And this is more or less what that looked like. So you can see our primary example right there, and how that is sort of crosswalked across the secondary effects and the species and habitat vulnerabilities. I'm not going to read through these all, but you can sort of glance down the page and see that a lot of these effects, drivers result in the same secondary effects and some similar species and habitat vulnerabilities. We originally in this phase 1 conceptual piece characterized this as our results, but the farther we got into phase 2, the more that I realized, and I want to mention it now because it is important later, that essentially that this is a set of hypotheses about our system that are testable with data, should we have data to be able to test it with. And I think that this is an interesting way to start thinking about a system's vulnerability to climate change. This was really critical for us for laying the groundwork for doing any analytics down the road. And so what we ended up doing was developing climate smart strategies that would explicitly address the specific species and habitat vulnerabilities that were in that previous table. And we'll look at an example of that in a second. But what I wanted to do real quickly is just read these off. They're big tent and they're very general, but they will become important. So number 1, maintain ecological integrity of beach and dune habitat. Number 2, integrate climate smart principles into restoration design. Number 3, manage non-climate stressors to buffer species and habitats. Number 4, plan and prepare for shoreline retreat. Number 5, research, test and experiment to learn what works. Number 6, outreach, and this is to increase awareness and climate impact fluency. And so this is how this looks. So going back to our species and habitat vulnerability. So this is sort of a combined species and habitat vulnerability, increased nest loss from flooding, which was in the far right column of the table that I just showed you. And here you can see how our broad tent strategies are applied. Under those strategies are very specific actions. So I'm just going to read through number 2 here, integrate climate smart principles into habitat restoration design. We have 3 specific actions. Promote natural dune profiles that will attenuate storm wave energy and provide plover nesting sites above the high tide line by controlling invasive vegetation. Very specific. Second one, build and restore habitat refugia such as inner dune and rear dune swales, sand levees that will provide buffers from predators and human-caused disturbance. And then the final one, design topography and employ plant palettes that provide space for snowy plover chick movement across foredunes and into mid-dune areas. So this is really how we wanted to drill. We wanted to go from the very general to the very specific, and it was a lot of cognitive drilling down. But this is something that you can do. Really, you could take this approach with any species and any habitat, and hopefully for those of you who are maybe thinking of taking similar approaches or have taken similar approaches, this is sort of resonating in terms of the thought process that would go into it. And so quick summary of part 1, this conceptual framework is really useful for developing strategies and actions, and then also generating testable hypotheses should you get to that phase. And that this framework is usable even without specific data sources. So in terms of primary data about your system, but also even if there are no climate predictions that are specific to your system, which is increasingly not the case for most systems. But if you have the knowledge to understand a system, you can develop the high probability scenarios like I just showed you. And then for us, because we do a lot of work with a single species, we really are interested in anything that helps us broaden the rationale for management beyond the species to include the habitat and ecosystem, which is really what we were hoping to do here. So I'm going to transition into this phase 2 part of our project now, which is this analytical piece. And this is the report that we produced here just a little bit more recently. So again, we wanted to look at the species. We also were very interested in the habitat, and we wanted to dig analytically into more of a site prioritization to inform future conservation actions. And so the way that we did that in this approach was, as I mentioned a couple times already, this was analytical, spatially explicit approach, quantitatively rigorous, and a data-rich approach. And so a little bit of background on that. Because snowy plovers are well monitored and we have a long-term data set, we're able to leverage this long-term data to understand climate change. This is just a sample plot of hatch and fledge rates from Monterey Bay, and the savvy among you will see that it looks like both of those rates are declining over time. But this is the type of data that is really useful for climate analyses, because we can go back and look at climate indices around temperature and precipitation. And if there are relationships, we can then project those relationships forward. And so this is sort of exactly the opposite of taking the conceptual approach, but thinking about all of that prior to doing this was really critical. So the specific objectives of this part 2 study were to understand how will climate change impact the reproductive success of snowy plovers in the future. And in so getting at that question, we want to understand what environmental factors are currently impacting reproductive success and what are the likely future impacts based on that. And then what management actions can be taken to address any impacts. And we did this by leveraging these long-term data sets. I already mentioned Recovery Unit 4, Monterey Bay, and Point Reyes National Seashore. And so we had, nest location data and hatching data from both of these areas. And then in order to put this in a spatial framework, we interpolated climate and habitat data across the landscape at 100-meter scale. And we analyzed plover hatching success in relation to these climate and habitat variables that we selected. And so our sample size, you can see here, we analyzed more than 6,000 clutches across Monterey Bay and Point Reyes. 400 or so of those had predator exclosures around them. And you can see here, this shot is of a female incubating her nest inside a nest exclosure. If you're not familiar with what a predator exclosure is, it's basically a cage that's put around the nest to exclude predators. And then we defined success as 1 or more chicks hatched from a clutch. And then what we did in terms of other variables and how we looked at both climate and habitat. So let's start with habitat. We're really interested in a measure of habitat that we know is going to be affected by sea level rise, because nesting above mean high water is critical. And our hypothesis is that sea level rise is going to cause beaches to narrow and reduce this distance to mean high water. So we use a year-round average for mean high water. We also really wanted to look at temperature and precipitation, because that is one of the indices that I already mentioned. We have historical data on those, and we can project into the future. And so the plot that you're looking at here is just a sample, some of the sample data. So this is minimum temperatures in May, one of the many monthly indices that we calculated in order to do this, this project. This is degrees Celsius, sorry, that's not labeled. And for Point Reyes and Monterey Bay. So you can see on average, it's a little bit cooler in Point Reyes in May. And so, like I said, we developed multiple, we probably had, 20 or so indices of temperature. And then the analytic framework was general linear models using logistic regression for the nest outcome of hatch or fail. And so let's talk about results, because right off the bat, we didn't have any area, so Monterey Bay versus Point Reyes, or year effects, which is great. We also had no precipitation effects that dropped out of the models right away. We did have trends related to earlier nests being more likely to hatch. That'll come back later in some of the kind of forward projections. And that is just, an interesting result in and of itself. It's moving into some of the climate effects, so the effects of temperature. So one of our primary findings, and when I highlight a finding here, the ones that I'm highlighting are statistically significant. Warmer temperatures in May and the previous October, so that's October prior, not in the nesting year, but in the prior year, resulted in lower hatching success. So if you look at our plot here, what we're looking at is hatching success on the y-axis, and again, that minimum temperature on the horizontal axis. And you can see that the warmer it gets, the lower hatching success is. And I want to point out here, because it's in bold and it's very important, is that this is for non-exclosed nests only. And you'll see why in a second when I pull up the next plot. But immediately we thought, well, this is interesting. This is not necessarily what we expected. And so we were wondering, is this a direct or indirect effect? And what could be the possible causal mechanism driving this? So this is the exact same plot that you just saw, but this is our first line of evidence that this temperature effect is possibly being driven by predators. So that bottom line is the same one you just saw. So that was non-exclosed nests, but we find that this upper line, which is the red dots, it's not a significant trend, but that we didn't have a pattern for exclosed nests. So right away, that gives us a little bit of information that there's something related to predators that could be driving this. So yes, we didn't have any significant effect of temperature for nests with predator exclosures. And so temperature must somehow be exerting some sort of direct or indirect effect on predators. So our second line of evidence on this is that we learned that warmer temps resulted in a higher likelihood that a nest was lost to predators. So this is sort of just another way of looking at the same information. So what we're looking at here again is temperature on the horizontal axis, and then the probability that a nest failed due to predation. Again, this is for non-exclosed nests only, because the ones that are in the nest cages are protected from predators. And this is a significant finding as well, that the warmer it gets, the more likely a nest failure is, higher the probability that a given nest failure was actually caused by predation. So we have two lines of evidence that predation is somehow involved in this temperature phenomenon. So we thought that was interesting. And then moving into the habitat stuff, we will find some sort of interesting interacting effects here. What we found with relation to distance to mean high water was that hatching success increased with increasing distance to mean high water. So, you're looking at this plot, you're seeing that, as you go out on the horizontal axis, and that's meters, that's also not labeled. The farther you are, the more meters you are from mean high water, the more likely overall, the higher the hatching success overall. But we also know that the converse of that is true, that the closer a nest was to mean high water, the more likely it failed due to flooding or other environmental causes. That in and of itself is not really a shocking finding. And so what that looks like is this, which is that these nests out here, even though there's this overall trend of increasing success, when these nests are lost, they are in fact lost to predators, versus these nests here, which are much more likely to be lost to environmental causes. So hopefully that's clear. And so there's a little bit of a paradox for plovers, right? The farther your nest is from mean high water, the more likely it is to hatch, but the probability that when it fails, it's due to predators is higher. So there's a little bit of a plover decision framework going on here, where they're sort of in between failure at the mean high water from environmental and the threat of predation above mean high water. And so this is another sort of way of looking at this, which is the probability that nest failure was due to predation as a function of distance to mean high water. And you can again see non-exclosed nests again. You can see that the higher you get, or the farther you get above mean high water, the more likely that a nest failed due to predation. This, let me go back for a second, because I want to just pause here for a second and say, this is not what we expected to find looking at climate and habitat. And it's really interesting to be able to get to a point where we can sort of elucidate a little bit, potentially a hypothetical causal mechanism for something that could be viewed objectively as a climate effect. And so one of the things that we were able to do was to predict future reproductive success based on the relationships that have been documented between plovers and these climate variables. And so this is just a selected scenario. I mentioned earlier that clutch initiation date did have some statistical trends. So when we project forward, we have to select a scenario. So this is the predicted probability of future hatching success, point raise, national seashore based on a nest initiation date of May 29th, and then average historic climate and mean high tide lines. And if you look at the sort of heat map up there, what you can see is that the top one is with exclosures and the bottom one is modeled with no exclosures. And the reason we did that is we have empirical evidence of the effect of exclosures on hatching rate. And so this isn't so bad up on this scenario into the future isn't so bad with exclosures where you're looking at hatch rates of between 66 and 75%. For this species biologically, so sort of stepping aside from the statistical side of it and the probability side of it, that is, those are, that increased probability of future hatching success is potentially going to get you to a better place versus not using exclosures. And so I mentioned earlier, one thing we were really interested in is what actions can be taken based on empirical evidence to mitigate climate risks. So we know that hatching success overall is probably going to decrease from in the range of 38 to 52% by the year 2070 in the absence of exclosures. So exclosures, and I've put in here in other predator management, are going to be critical. We're not empirically testing in this study the effect of predator removal. We are working on another study right now where we are going to be doing that. But when we talk in the plover management world about predator management, we usually include exclosures and other predator management sort of as the same type of approach. But I also wanted to highlight that there is a risk of mortality to incubating adult plovers from using exclosures. And that's something we've documented in our work here in Monterey Bay. It's been documented up in Oregon. It's been documented for other imperiled plover species like the piping plover. And so there are also some trade-offs between using this type of management device. And you might be wondering, what is the risk? Well, the risk is predation of the adults usually from owls or other things that key in on the exclosures. And so we don't want to lose adults from our population. And then looking really broadly at actual physical habitat losses, I've included this figure here, which is just a plot of nests 2020 from Moss Landing State Beach, just so you can get an idea of how close these birds are nesting, to the water line, and how they are literally on the front lines of climate change. And in places where shorelines don't have space to transgress, maybe this one is an example of where it does. We've got a good dune system and some agricultural lands there. There's possibility of landward transgression, but in other places, maybe not so much. So in addition to this effect that we looked at, or we've been talking about, which is this narrower beaches, which with increased proximity to mean high water, there's sort of a quantitative amount of beach habitat that we are able to project that will be lost. So this is for sea level rise of 1 and 2 meters at both sites, Point Reyes and Monterey Bay. And so you can see that between 21% and 52% of habitat is going to be lost at those levels whenever they arrive, whether that's 2070 or sooner or later. And also one of the key things to point out here is that Point Reyes is a little bit more resilient than Monterey Bay, and that may be because there's more room for transgression. It may be because there's more sand, there's more there's more dunes in their system there, more elevation. And this is I think the final slide I'm gonna show you, but this is the effect of habitat loss, adding in the effect of habitat loss due to sea level rise. What we're looking at is the predicted probability of hatching success, again, using Point Reyes, for all of the various sites in Point Reyes in response to projected future climate change and increasing sea level rise. And then this is modeled with and without exclosures. And so you can see, if you look at these plots, these are all the nesting sites at Point Reyes. So this gets at that site prioritization. And again, this is the actual probability here. These are probability plots here. So you can see that the use of exclosures really increases the probability of hatching success in the future. You can also see that some sites perform better than other sites. And so if you're thinking about making conservation investments, at certain sites relative to other sites, this is the kind of information that would give you maybe some empirical support for, investing in one site over another. I do want to mention just one more time, because I think it's critical, the focus on exclosures here. The reason that it's modeled is because we have empirical evidence of the benefits of exclosures, and we hope to soon be able to do a similar type of approach for the benefits of predator removal, painting with a very broad brush across the range of the Pacific Coast population. Predator removal is a very common strategy for managing snowy plover populations. So we really want to learn more about that in the same climate context. And so to summarize the results of part 2, hatching success decreases with warmer temperatures, and there's some evidence, 2 lines of evidence, that this is a result of increased nest predation. There's some interaction between temperature and predators. Hatching success also decreases with proximity to mean high water level due to increased risk of inundation. And clearly that is something that's going to increase with sea level rise. So these are both things that are really valuable to know and of concern. We also know about these kind of large scale losses in habitat that are going to be caused by sea level rise, and that we have an overall reduction in hatching success that we expect of between 38 to 52%, which is significant. If a good hatching rate for snowy plovers is say 50 to 60%, and you are expecting a 50% reduction, that's quite biologically significant. And that, as far as what we were able to model here empirically, nest exclosures are critical for the future. I'll mention the predator management one more time. We really would like to get a handle on that in the context of understanding, the future demographics of the species. And so I mentioned that I would just touch really briefly on management implications for this. So I hope it's clear by now that on outer coastal beaches in Monterey Bay, Recovery Unit 4, and probably more broadly on the Pacific Coast, plovers need to have predator-free space to move landward to adapt to sea level rise. This study provides empirical evidence that reducing predation pressure is a climate adaptation strategy, which is definitely not where we expected to land. But if you think back to that conceptual framework, it was reflected in that one of the strategies, which was manage non-climate stressors in order to provide time for species and habitats to adapt. And then finally, and this sort of just echoes the second one, we have a climate-related rationale to conduct management of this non-climate stressor, which is, again, not where we expect it to land, but it's a really interesting piece that fits into this broader, ecosystem management framework. And I want to sort of wrap it up here by going back to this original table and just kind of merging this conceptual and more analytical approach. So if you think about where we started, this is where we started. We started with this prediction that sea level rise would cause narrower and possibly lower elevation beaches, and that our predicted species vulnerability that's being highlighted here was higher nest mortality from flooding, is the example I use. And so we were able to provide empirical evidence for all of these things. The other thing that came out of this study that I didn't demo in the beginning is that our prediction for increased heat and drought would likely result in range expansion or shift of predator species, resulting in higher nest, chick, and possibly adult mortality. This one was not quite as sort of evident, because we need to sort of explore those lines of support for there being a predator link a little bit more. But again, testable hypotheses generated from, understanding the system and expert elicitation with some pretty reasonable support. So I love this approach. I love the meldings of this approach. And I love that they're both useful. So this study demonstrates the power of long-term data in identifying future responses to a changing climate, and also just emphasizing the underlying causal mechanisms, which really for this species and many others, understanding that is what we need to do to be able to implement management and some of these broader strategies that are going to help species and habitats adapt to climate change. And so, again, just contrasting these two approaches, this conceptual expert knowledge data poor framing approach with this much more analytic, rigorous approach. They're both great. If you can only do one, I think there's a real value in running through the conceptual approach to learn about your system and help set you up to do the things that you might want to do after that. That's the end of my talk, but I do want to acknowledge our funders, Jake Martin at U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and Dave Press at National Park Service, with funding from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Ventura Fish and Wildlife Office, and Point Reyes National Seashore, all the many Point Blue staff who work to collect the data here, our partner biologists and land managers who have implemented all of this work, all the wonderful photographers who took these great photos. And then just these reports, which came out of parts 1 and part 2. Part 2 will hopefully be working on a publication soon, but you can feel free to look at pointblue.org, where you can get the part 1 report. You can email me at pointblue.org, and I'm happy to share that part 2 report with you. And that's all I have. Thanks so much for your time today.
All right. Thank you so much, Kriss. Lots of good information and good videos. We had lots of real-time reactions to the videos at the beginning. So I think from people and dogs, it looks like, that are nearby and also watching the presentation. Really enjoyed it. We do have several questions here in the Q&A box already, so I can go ahead and start to relay those to you if you're ready.
I'm ready, and I will leave my screen up just in case there's a slide that somebody wants to go back to.
Great. Okay, and I'm just going to dive right in, and folks, please feel free to continue typing questions into the Q&A box. We'll try to get to as many as we can here. I'm going to start with a few questions that came in kind of the first part of the talk, so maybe a little more kind of clarifying type questions to get through. Bryant asked, what do snowy plovers feed on in inland saline waters that do not have, pardon the pronunciation, talatrid amphipods?
Right. Yeah, so simpler systems, brine flies. Yeah.
All right, asked and answered. Okay, let's see. This next question is regarding, Tess had a question just looking for some clarity on the plover nest locations. She said, I thought high rack line was below MHHW and where snowy plover nests are, but later said plover's nests were above MHHW. Yeah,
I mean, it typically, so mean high water is just, it's an average of the high water mark. It's a topographic feature that is included and that's extractable. And I didn't mention this. We use the USGS Cosmos sea level rise modeling, coastal storm and sea level rise modeling system for the for that part of it. And so mean high water is a feature that's extractable. So from the ecological standpoint, yes, plovers typically nest above mean high water, and if they don't, they often lose their nest to tide. But mean high water is something that is, it's a mean, right? So it's variable throughout both the season and across years, and as habitats change as well. One thing I didn't point out, but is maybe worth noting, is that if you wanted a study like this to be extremely robust, you would want to extract, mean high water from really high resolution photographs for every year, for all the years of the study. We weren't able to do that. I mean, it'd be a huge amount of processing, but for it to be extremely rigorous, that would be something that would probably be worth doing. So I hope I answered the question. Yes, plovers predominantly nest above mean high water. The high rack line can be right at mean high water after a big high tide event. So yeah, the person who asked the question, isn't it typically below mean high water? Yes, it is typically. The high rack line is typically below mean high water. That's correct.
All right, this next question came in. Just seeking some clarity about some of your study results, and I apologize, I didn't pinpoint exactly when it came in. But Erica asks if overall there was higher mortality or egg loss due to flooding than due to predation in your study period if you look at all nests.
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't have the answer to that. I would have to actually go back, and look at the report. But my sense is, so I've worked in the field collecting data for 25 years, that documented predator loss is going to be higher overall as an overall cause of nest loss. And in fact, I was just looking at Monterey Bay results for 2022, and we did have a big tide year this year. So we did lose many nests to tide this year, and it's maybe going to vie for one of the top categories in this region and this year, but it's not going to be more than the combination of all predator species in a given area in a given year. But the really interesting thing, and this is a little bit of a sidebar, but one of the reasons that we see plovers moving towards mean high water, we think, is to escape predation pressure in these high predator rich systems. And typically, like, what they're escaping is common raven predation, which is a real problem across the range, and it's sort of episodic, and I call catastrophic, where you'll have ravens come into an area like a river spit, for example. There will be 20 or 25 active nests, and they'll take 12 of them the first day, then the remainder the second day, and they'll completely wipe out an area. So I think there's a vigilance component for plovers when they're towards farther above mean high water, because it's more hunted, it's more patrolled by predators, and particularly by ravens.
Related to that, we have a couple of other questions specifically about predation, so I'll get to those here. Brian asks, do California gulls prey on Monterey Bay or Point Reyes snowy plover nesting populations?
Occasionally you do have gulls that become predatory, and maybe it's just a serendipitous event that they learn about a nest. And then once they learn, they become a problem predator. But yes, we have had, I believe, both California and Western gulls that we've identified on cameras. They're really hard to identify with nest evidence because they land, they eat the eggs, and then they fly off. And so, yeah, they are not a massive problem, but they do have potential to be a problem. And in particular, what we look for is an injured gull. Injured gulls are more likely to become a problem. Or I guess I flip that on its head and say, when we've had problems with gulls as sort of specialist predators, they've typically, had something about them that has caused them to maybe not be able to range as widely as a normal healthy gull. And we also do have, because of the increase in California gull population in California, we do have problems with trampling. We get a lot of sort of post-breeding season California gull flocks on outer coastal beaches, particularly in Monterey Bay at our two river mouths, and they do actually trample nests.
Next question here along these lines. Jennifer asks, is there any data regarding the trade-off between hatch success using nest closures and potential future recruitment from predator take of the adults due to exposures?
Yeah, we have not done that sort of done the math around that, but it has been done. I think it's Larson et al. For piping plovers. And it's it's what you would expect, which is that you have to produce a lot more young if you're going to use exclosures because of the risk. And so for Pacific Coast snowy plovers, and I'll just restrict myself to Recovery Unit 4, where we work, we're struggling to produce population stability level plovers, which for us, our metric is 1.0 chicks per breeding male per year. We're struggling to produce that right now without using exclosures. So we are very, very sparing, and so is Point Reyes, very sparing in using them to the extent that we can be. So currently in Monterey Bay, we don't use exclosures unless we have to. The Point Reyes National Seashore, it's a much smaller population than Monterey Bay, and they really will not get any hatching success without using exclosures. So it's a really, really good question. One of the things we're looking at doing right now is thinking about updating the population viability analysis for the snowy plover, because there's so much more information now than when it was conducted, and for the federal recovery plan. And that would be a really interesting thing to try to incorporate in there, because we have some good data, empirical data showing what those risks are.
Okay, another predation question here. David asks, do you have any documentation of free-ranging cats taking plover nests, chicks, or adults?
Yes, yes, we do. Unfortunately, yeah, we have track evidence at nests. We have cats in habitat, and it's almost always typically feral cats, which are also selectively controlled if they're lethally controlled if they're in the habitat. But yeah, I mean, it's an issue anywhere you have people who are maintaining cat colonies, where there's riprap, things like that. Cats are potentially an issue. They used to be a little bit of a larger issue in the Monterey Bay region than they are right now, but I know there's other places where they are issues. And the person who asked the question is onto something really important, which is that it's not just the eggs. They will take chicks, and they will also take adults. And we have a couple cases here in Monterey, suspected cases of adult loss here. We didn't have cameras on the nest, so it's not confirmed, but nests that are fine, and then they're abandoned, and there's cat tracks at the nest. So that's very likely an adult depredation of an adult. And our study population at this point isn't 100% banded, but historically we had maybe between a 80 and 95% banded population. So when that banded bird that should be incubating a nest disappears during the breeding season, it's dead.
Mm-hmm. All right, one more. Charlotte asks, have nest decoys been considered as a method to ease predation impact?
Yeah, funny enough, they have been used for social attraction up in Humboldt County, and successfully as well. But yeah, as decoys, I'm not sure that that's been considered, but there have been studies exploring the use of conditioned taste aversion. And there's a paper, I think it's Brinkman et al. From the San Diego region, a conditioned taste aversion around with eggs, so treated eggs and ravens. And it's equivocal whether it's effective. It's challenging with ravens because they're so smart that they essentially can distinguish between, that sort of thing and something that's quote natural. I recognize I'm diverging a little bit here, but one of the things that is done to manage ravens throughout the range for plovers is we have a corvid specific avicide that is placed on towers. And the process of doing that is to provide untreated eggs for a long period of time until the ravens are habituated to taking them. And then hopefully they will take the treated eggs. So that's been somewhat successful here. But yeah, the decoy hasn't been used, but there are a lot of ideas like that have been generated. And so one of the wacky ones along that lines of like, well, what can we do that we're not doing now is, what if we just removed eggs and provided dummy eggs for adults to incubate? And those eggs were carbachol treated. So not just carbachol treated eggs or, aversive conditioning eggs that are sort of placed in the environment, but ones where there's actually an incubating plover. And the reason that that has been considered is that we think, based on the behavior of ravens in the field, that they're keying in on plover nests by flushing plovers from the nests. This is something we've watched them do. They also do it with other water birds in Monterey Bay region and probably elsewhere. So they'll do this sort of loop-de-loop flight. They'll go up and they'll go down, and the down flight's very threatening, and birds flush off nests, and then they come into the nest. This idea of can we modify something at an actual nest has been something that people have talked about, but those conversations really haven't gone anywhere because of the issues around getting recovery permits modified to do those sorts of things is pretty difficult. But we are at a phase with this particular, managing this population that, creative ideas are what we are having to implement, very creative ideas around management of predators on pretty much a yearly basis. And we tried the community, we really try to learn from each other. So I hope that answers the question. No, we have not used decoys yet for predator related stuff.
All right, we have a couple questions here pertaining more to the analysis piece, statistical analysis. Erica asks, did you create GLMs for the other variables in your results/hypotheses table, or just the one with temperature and hatch success?
Yes, good question. We did also look at fledging success, and I just didn't present those results because the story around hatching is just one that I find really interesting. And so I kind of wanted to focus on that. But I can tell you that our results around fledging success are that warmer temperatures will increase fledging success. So there is some good news there. So again, precipitation, no area effects, no year effects. Actually, I take that back. There was an area effect. There's a stronger effect in Monterey than there is in Point Reyes. I think there's a non-significant effect in Point Reyes. So, which is interesting because Point Reyes is a little bit colder than Monterey Bay. So it seems like it should be the reverse, but I'd have to double check the report to ferret out those nuances. But overall, some good news. And also just to add on to that a little bit, we are completing another piece of analysis actually in review right now, looking at adult survival. And it's not this particular study that I just framed for you, but warming is expected to have the same effects on adult survival, which is to increase adult survival. So there's some sort of, potentially, I don't want to say benefits to plovers because it all has to be thought about in the context of the decreasing habitat. But it is, I guess, nice to know that those two other really important demographic measures are not going in the same direction as hatching success. So, but yes, we looked at habitat, we looked at temperature, and we looked at precipitation, and those are the three things in the models for both hatching and fledging success.
It's nice to hear about a slightly hopeful change. So in the bigger context, but still potential positive. Okay, so another question, has there been an analysis regarding wind events, especially in the early season?
Yeah, it's so interesting that you bring that up because in the current work that we're doing, which involves Monterey Bay, Oceano Dunes, and Vandenberg Space Force, where Point Blue has other snowy plover projects, we are looking at including wind in our analyses because it is so critical for plovers. They lose a lot of nests to wind burial every year. And, as that goes, it could be highly influential. So we have not looked at it yet. We're hoping to look at it. Another thing we're really interested in and weren't able to put in this analysis, but we might want to try to put into a subset of analyses in the future. And maybe this is one of your questions, but I'll just go ahead with it, which is and maybe people are aware of this, but the reductions in coastal fog, that might be what is causing this temperature predator effect, because it's a lot easier for ravens and other avian predators to hunt in the absence of coastal fog. It's a lot easier for them to use those wonderful updrafts that we usually have when coastal fog is blowing away, and that's a trend it's been documented in this region since probably, I think, 2013. I think there's been something like a 30% decrease in coastal fog. So yeah, I mean, ideally we look at those things too that we think are significant.
All right, some questions here kind of generally about this species and relative to others. Monica asks, can you speak to how the California least tern or other beach bird species have fared compared to the Western snowy plover population?
Yeah, I mean, I wish I was more of a least tern expert. You know, my understanding is that, you know, so the range of the least tern and the plovers, Pacific Coast population of plovers are somewhat different. I mean, they do overlap, but the least tern is a much more southern species. And so I won't say too much more. There's maybe other experts on the webinar today who know a lot more about terns than I do, but you know, there's issues with, you know, forage fish availability off Southern California. And the tern, I think, has also, you know, they face a lot of the same issues in terms of climate modeling. Has the climate modeling been done for habitat for terns? To the best of my knowledge, no, but I should probably stop there.
All right, next, Charlotte asks, do plovers have competition with other species for food or nesting habitat?
Yeah, that's a good question. So mostly who they have competition with is each other. You know, we do get overlaps in nesting with killdeer, in some cases with California least terns. And a couple of folks have looked at, you know, sort of the umbrella effects of California least terns and snowy plovers kind of co-nesting. Ben Pearl and San Francisco Bay has looked at that. I think it's been looked at in Southern California as well. And so I think there's been some level of documentation that plovers sort of tend to benefit from the anti-predator vigilance of California least terns in some cases, but not always. You know, in our system here, other overlaps are American avocets and to maybe a lesser extent, black-necked stilts nesting in that environment. And we've also had outer coastal nesting of Caspian terns, believe it or not, in the Monterey Bay region. So another sort of strong anti-predator effect that could potentially benefit plovers. But what we see more often than that is in our really dense plover nesting areas. So in Monterey Bay, that's at our 2 river mouths, we see plovers just in intense competition with each other. We see adults attacking other people's chicks. We see chick stealing. We see interesting, you know, we see chick adoptions. We see interesting, you know, behaviors where the high levels of territoriality during establishment of nests and on these river spit areas. But then once those areas have been established, all the males sort of tend to hang out elsewhere so that they don't have to keep fighting over their territories while the females incubate. So yeah, it's more intra-specific competition. For nesting habitat and for food. Yeah, I don't think that there's a huge amount of competition for food. It's just more, are those RAC subsidies present on beaches? And it's, you know, it's a huge issue in Southern California where beaches are groomed. You know, if you take away the food source, and by far the expert on this is Jenny Dugan at UC Santa Barbara, who's done a whole career's worth of work on this. You take away the RAC and you lose you know, the suite of shorebirds that feed on the RAC, you know, consumers. So you lose all the plover species, and then you're also losing all those nutrients into the system. So yeah, I mean, I guess sort of broadly, plovers would be competing with, you know, other species of plovers for, you know, the surface dwelling creatures. But that's just my opinion. I don't think that there's a huge amount of competition there.
All right, we have just a few questions left in the chat. So if you're an attendee on the line and you have a burning question, be sure to go ahead and get that in now. For this next one, I'm actually going to combine 2 questions because they're very similar. So I'll read them both. The first one is short. So basically, this is about strategies. What other tools are available for managing predation on plover nests besides exclosures? And then the kind of longer version of this, Angelina had a couple of questions. She says, historically, humans don't have a great track record with saving one species by reducing another, in this case, the predator. Are there other strategies other than exposures that can help reduce predation? Additionally, doesn't the removal of one predator leave room for another predator to come in? Maybe there's an upstream problem that these predators' habitat and food source is diminishing, and maybe by restoring that, it could relieve some of the pressure on plovers. So
Right.
just what's your take on some of these potential strategies?
Yeah, great questions. Thanks for the questions, you guys. Yeah, I mean, so like I said earlier, broadly, people use exclosures essentially if they have to. They are used more routinely in some places than others because, you know, either They cannot conduct lethal predator control or, for a variety of reasons. And there's a whole kind of suite of reasons why you wouldn't be able to sort of selectively remove problem predators. It's too urbanized, it's too public. You don't have the funding support to do it. You don't have the permits to do it, et cetera. So still working on part one of the set of questions. Again, super broadly, what's really going to help is, ecosystem processes, keeping those intact, right? So allowing natural rock deposition, working on habitat restoration. One of the big game changers for the Population and Recovery Unit 1, which is the far northern end of the population. So it's Oregon, who has met and exceeded their recovery goals and has produced a sustainable population. One of their key drivers of their success has been habitat restoration. And they have had a historically Ammophila dominated, which is the invasive European dune grass system. So they've restored, their natural topography. To some extent, this has been done down at Vandenberg Space Force Base by our Point Blue team down there as well, working with the Space Force team. So habitat restoration is going to buffer plovers from predators in a much, better way than having them in these more marginal, invasive dominated landscapes. But however, and this is a big however, our most incredible, pristine, beautiful, buffered habitat that we have in Monterey Bay, one knowledgeable raven can wipe out 60, 70, 80 nests in a few days. And so sort of trending into the second set of questions there, it's a really good and logical question to find out, oh, hey, are we not providing enough habitat for these other species? There's probably some cases where there are conflicts, and I highlighted the northern harrier in the beginning. And there's a few other cases where maybe there's something like there's a problem burrowing owl, and it's another sensitive species that's either listed or California species special concern. The harrier is one we have had occasional problems with. And we've taken a very different management approach with harriers. Like we have in this region have never lethally controlled harriers. But we have had problems with male harriers who will also eat eggs, which is something that was not known prior to about 2007 when it was first documented in Monterey Bay, and then also subsequently in Oregon. And we've had a couple episodes of that were just catastrophic, where we've had one nesting male harrier eat responsible for depredating like 100 snowy plover nests. So I think that there are examples of what the second question was sort of getting at, that northern harriers have had their habitat, at least in California, incredibly reduced. They're a species special concern. So we approach anything around them very differently. Common ravens, as I mentioned, are, a pretty huge limiting factor for the species. Working with Fish and Wildlife Service, with Cheryl Strong, who just led a paper that brought together all the folks across the range to sort of look at the barriers of, barriers and opportunities around managing ravens and what that means for plovers. And as I pointed out with the population trajectory, we've got a species that, or a listed population of a species that has increased a little bit, due to management. It's a heavily managed species, but it's just not getting that final step. So concurrent with that, and this is particularly true in Central California, and this is the sort of argument that we put in the paper, which is Strong et al. 2021 that just came out in Human Wildlife Interactions, is that the raven is a limiting factor at this point. This was a policy paper, not an analytics paper. But I'll give you an example of what I mean, which is prior to 2007, 2008, we had lost between 1984 and 2007, and this is the stat in the paper, we had lost something like fewer than 20 nests to corvids in Monterey Bay. And now, beginning in about 2008 or so, it's the single largest cause of nest loss. And that's because that species that population in the Western United States is so large. It's causing extensive problems for other species. And the one that's really highlighted is for sage grouse across the Western United States, where ravens are really a limiting factor for population recovery for them as well. And so now management entities, Migratory Bird, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, are having to look at managing ravens actually much more broadly. Our approach here, and it's been the approach at almost all other sites that have managed plovers and also least terns affected as well, which is if there's a problem predator, that's the predator that's managed. So we're not doing sort of wholesale, removal of predators. if the predator crosses into the habitat or is in an adjacent habitat and is crossing into the habitat, they're targeted for removal. We also published a companion paper in that issue of Human Wildlife Interactions, where we actually, for a few years, for these lethally controlled ravens, we looked at gut contents and were able to, validate that the animals that were controlled had plover remains in them, which is something that's not often done, with management. So I think, the plover is conservation reliant for these management actions. In the long run, we will have to keep taking these management actions, but doing these other sort of bigger umbrella strategies like habitat restoration are going to be really critical to the future for, for the habitat to adapt to sea level rise, but also to sort of, buffer, give plovers areas that they can nest that are more predator free, hopefully. So I hope that answers the question. It's a good question.
All right, we have one final question in the chat. I think this is a good one to end with for today. And you've touched on this a little bit throughout the presentation and the questions, but Rose asks, what do you think are the benefits to the beach ecosystem of preserving this specific species?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. Does the plover is it the otter of the sandy beach? Is it a keystone species? Is it a link in a critical chain of events that without it, everything will go awry? I think the answer to that is probably no. But it is an iconic species. And so I sort of tend to flip that on its head and think about, if we cannot do the work of protecting the plover, which triggers us to think about all these other things related to the environment, to the habitat. And I can tell you that, for the most part, the management framework that I work in, things are not being driven off of, well, let's go out and do some really great work in our sandy beach ecosystem to develop and restore and protect. And maybe that's changing a little bit, especially with all the funding that's coming through the state for coastal resilience at this point. A lot of the work that's going on in the ecosystem is actually triggered by listed species. And that's not because there's a ton of funding for listed species, which you all probably already know. I don't need to tell you that. But it's because of the kind of statutory obligations of the management entities, and also the interest. So the way that I look at it is that it's an iconic species. It's part of the legacy that we want to protect for the future. It's an indicator. We talk a lot about what are indicators of healthy functioning ecosystems. If you restore a dune from a poor dune or a degraded dune system, even if it's in downtown Santa Cruz, this just happened at Seabright Beach, where there was a large restoration in a very public area, and plovers nested there within a few years of the restoration. They are really an indicator of a habitat that is, highly threatened, not just in this country, but globally. Sandy beaches are highly threatened. And you will find the corresponding imperiled species of plovers everywhere you go, whether it's the New Zealand dotterel or the hooded in New Zealand, or the hooded plover in Australia, or the Malaysian plover in the Malaysian archipelago. And so we as a society have to make decisions about whether we want to preserve these iconic species. And I feel that we can't really preserve the environments that they thrive in without preserving the species themselves. It just isn't going to happen. So I hope that makes sense.
Wonderful response. I think that's a great note to end on here. Thank you so much, Kriss, for a great presentation and for answering all of these questions from our group here today. And thank you also to the participants for joining and for submitting those great questions for our speaker. Lots of kudos here, and thanks to you and appreciation in the chat box, Kriss. And before I close us out, do you have any final thoughts, comments you want to leave us with today?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I highlighted that, we have some really key CDFW properties that have, snowy plovers nesting on them in California. And, Point Blue, we're always looking to, further our partnerships. And if there's anybody in the audience today who, is interested in learning more about, the work that's done on CDFW properties, I'd be glad to, connect with those people.
Great, thank you for that. I know you had your contact information up for a long time, so hopefully people were able to grab that. And if not, feel free to reach out to me as well, and I would be happy to put you in touch. All right, thanks everyone again for a great morning, great start to the Friday. Once again, the presentation was recorded. We'll get it up within the next couple of weeks on the lecture series website on our archive page, so do please check that out. And other than that, we will see you next time. Have a wonderful day, great weekend, and we'll see you later.